Hi, this is my presentation on the American Revolution. So first of all, I have basically what led up to the actual revolution. First of all, there were the Navigation and Stamp Act. Navigation Acts were enforced and really strict regulations on colonial trade and basically allowed Britain to gain power and things like that through America's trade. While America's economy depleted, Britain's economy was growing because of these acts. And the Stamp Act, they placed taxes on any paper product, so paper, stamps, newspapers, legal documents, even commercial documents, they all had taxes on them. Then we had the Townshend Acts. They placed a high tax on anything that came out of Britain. So paper, lead, paint, tea, they all had really high taxes. The Boston Massacre was a massacre that happened in Boston, Massachusetts, and 5 colonists were shot by British soldiers and 6 other colonists were wounded by those soldiers. In the middle of winter, there was a fight that happened, but the records, all records basically say something different. People say fists were thrown, people say that snowballs were thrown at each other, but there's really no actual documentation of what actually happened. Then we have the Boston Tea Party. The British had repealed all their taxes on all their goods except for on tea. So in retaliation of this, the Americans tried to basically boycott all British tea companies, and they were trying to smuggle in Dutch teas instead. But that ended up being a lot harder than they thought, so they came up with another plan, and a group of colonists, most of them were from the Sons of Liberty, which is a group from America of mostly colonists who really wanted to move, separate from England. They really wanted independence. And they got onto a ship in the Boston Harbor and they dumped 342 chests of British tea into the Boston Harbor. And then we have the Intolerable Acts, which these were basically a British retaliation to the Boston Tea Party. And the British had allowed blockades to happen around the Boston Harbor, so they were stopping all imports from coming into the Boston Harbor and all exports from going out of the harbor. So America was basically doing hardly any trade with outside countries because the Boston Harbor was one of the biggest ports at the time. Next, we just have a couple key leaders in the American Revolution. First, there's Abigail Adams. She is the wife of Samuel Adams, and she was a hard advocate for women's rights in the new form of government that they were creating. And she wrote many, many, many letters to her husband telling him to not forget the women in the country. Don't forget to add us in. Don't leave us out. We need rights too. We're not just here for your enjoyment. Next, we have Thomas Jefferson. He was a delegate from Virginia, and obviously he wrote the Declaration of Independence, which was the document that basically we used to declare our independence from Britain. Next is Alexander Hamilton. He had helped write the Federalist Papers, and these were basically articles that helped explain what parts of the Constitution were to people who were kind of against the Constitution, the kind of people who were in the middle. They weren't exactly patriots, they weren't exactly loyalists, they're on the fence. He was also a huge military aide to George Washington. Next we have Ben Franklin, who he proposed the general idea of one government, one central government. He's the one that came up with the idea for that and basically came up with the whole idea for our current government system. He also helped Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence. Then we have George Washington, the first ever commander-in-chief, first president of the United States. He was a really early advocate for independence like really early on, before the revolution was even a thought. He was an advocate for independence from Britain. And he was also well trusted in the Constitutional Convention. So a lot of people were trying to get their ideas approved by George Washington, because if George Washington approved, almost everybody in the room would approve. Then we have Patrick Henry. He actually stated that Americans should have the same exact rights as the British did, which these rights would have been the right to be taxed by their own representatives in government. He also thought that the stopping of trade with Britain wasn't enough. He really, really wanted to go to war. So he thought that it would be like a good payback for what the British had done to America. And last we have Samuel Adams. He helped lead the Boston Massacre, and he also helped organize the Sons of Liberty in the first place. And he was actually supposed to be arrested in Concord, but something else ended up happening, and this basically started the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Next, I have the effects of racial differences in the Revolutionary War. So actually, a lot of the African slaves that were in the South were trying to use the war as sort of a distraction to escape from the South, to get to different places. And many of the British soldiers that were in America actually tried to help them escape to different countries so they could be free. The Africans in the North actually became really good writers during this time, and they wrote a lot of things about the war, about anti-slavery, and how basically trying to advocate towards their own kind in America. And the North actually tried to use the victory of the Revolutionary War to jumpstart the anti-slavery movement in America. And after the victory of the Revolutionary War, white people in the South saw settlement restrictions as British oppression, and so they were trying to move westward. But these British restrictions on settlement in the West were keeping them from doing that. And this caused the natives to be treated even worse by the Americans, and they started wanting more and more land from the natives, and the natives were being pushed farther and farther towards the West Coast. And a lot of the Americans began to think that the Native Americans could be considered decent people if they had been educated and went through reform. So basically converting them to Christianity and putting them through basic schooling, but learning mostly about the Americans and not Native American culture.